Been reflecting on vocation this month about the ways our lives tell us where we should be headed, about being awake enough to ourselves and the world to hear the still small voice of calling. As Frederick Buechner said, there's nothing like discovering the intersection of your deep gladness and the world's deep need. Now, it's true that all of this talk about vocation can come off as the talk of overprivileged people who have the freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want. Not everyone can just change their job, that's for sure. Not all of us are in the position to align our work lives with our deepest gladness. We do need to watch our privilege, I think, when we talk about vocation. And yet, one of the most privileged things we can do is assume that people who aren't in a certain social class are always unhappy and unable to change parts of their lives to better fit their deepest selves. Vocation includes both the work we do for money and the work we do perhaps as volunteers to make the world a better place. Everyone in every social class would do well to listen for the voice of vocation and do the things in the world, even the small things, that make the world a little better. So when it comes to blue-collar work, to social class and vocation, it's complicated, to say the least. Still, that hardly ever stops Unitarian Universalists, so we'll wade in for a few minutes this morning and see what happens. Today, I want to focus on the dignity and importance of blue-collar work. But first, we ought to be clear what we're talking about. Blue-collar jobs are historically those which feature physical labor and don't have stringent educational requirements. They're typically paid much lower than white-collar jobs, not always. Today I want to ask, how can Unitarian Universalist congregations be aware of and sensitive to professional diversity, both in our communities, outside the congregation, and within the congregation itself? I want to avoid two extremes. On the one hand, it's easy to over-glorify blue-collar labor. White-collar workers daydream about leaving it all behind and doing work that ends at the end of the shift. Have you ever had that thought? Anybody here ever had that? But factory workers, for example, are often at physical risk, and all the OSHA regulations in the world can't mitigate that completely. The work takes a toll on the body. On the other hand, blue-collar work has its benefits. It is typically over at the end of the day. No holidays or vacations usually, full of returning emails and phone calls. And it is deeply satisfying to step back and look at the completed highway or house or landscape job, or in my case when I worked in a factory, propane tank, to deliver the truckload of goods to across the country, or to complete a well-assembled auto part. There is satisfaction in blue-collar work. Blue-collar vocation for Unitarian Universalists is not, though, an easy topic. The difficulty of our relationship with blue-collar work is demonstrated by, and probably rooted in, our divided historical heritage. The Universalists, at least in early America, were largely blue-collar folk, largely didn't have formal education, although that changed as the years went on, and it wasn't exclusively the case. But Universalist preachers traveled the country, teaching that God was love, that hell couldn't exist, or at least we couldn't be there forever, since a loving God would not punish her children forever, and that we then ought to follow Jesus' example in loving one another sacrificially. It's hard to imagine now, but there were Universalist tent revivals all over the country. Way out in the sticks where I'm from in Indiana, I took a motorcycle ride out once to an apartment building. And the cornerstone in that apartment building has a little plaque that says Universalist Church of so-and-so, whatever little town that was, founded in 18-something. And that property was bought and turned over to, or turned into apartment buildings. That's not an unusual story in the Midwest. There were, in these tent revivals that were put on by Universalists, there were singing and shouting and preachers who hooped and hollered. They were attended by people who had spent their lives scared of a hateful, vengeful, punishing God. They came to believe in universalism in dramatic fashion at those revivals. They rushed the altars, crying and praying thankful to hear that God might love them enough not to torture them eternally for what some imagine might be sin. The Unitarians were a little less emotional about the whole project. The American Unitarians were often highly educated and well paid, again, not exclusively, but often. They too imagined a God who was love, but their most important message, at least it seems to me, was that God is in each person, in and between and among us, not above and beyond us. So they said, look no further than your own spirit to find all the resources you need to guide you through life. The Unitarians believed every person should have access to the beautiful things in our existence. A great idea, though their execution was sometimes somewhat clumsy. The Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing is a good example. So Channing stood before a group of mechanics apprentices in 1840 in Boston and delivered what came to be called as the lectures on the elevation of the laboring portion of the community. Catchy from the very beginning. Channing, who was a member of Boston's heady, high-status Brahmin social class, laid out his hopes for the laboring class in 2 lectures. The lectures were delivered in meetings held in the library that was supported by and created for the use of the members of the Mechanics' Trade Union. And it's worth pausing just to take in the scene. Channing, a member of the Boston Brahmin class again, standing before working people in a suit and tie, standing in their library, prescribing what these working folks need to do to better themselves. It wouldn't go well today, I think, but Channing did do some good. His approach was, though, something less than radical. So Marx at this time, Karl Marx, is 10 years away from publishing his manifesto that called for an armed overthrow of the upper classes by the working classes. And Channing, in his lectures, prescribed thought, not revolution, but thought as the preferred method of laboring class elevation. He said, quote, every man in whatsoever condition is to be a student. No matter what other vocation he may have, his chief vocation is to think. Specifically, Channing encouraged, quote, force of thought exerted for the acquisition of truth. He was not advocating abandoning physical labor to while away life in the library. Now, it's kind of hypocritical because that's exactly how he was spending his life. But nevertheless, working class people, he said, should learn to master their thoughts and be reflective, not necessarily aim to spend hours and hours poring over books or visiting museums. Farmers should learn about farming. Machinists should learn about the inner workings of their machines. All people should develop a taste for beauty and art. In the lectures, Channing said, let me add that the farmer and the mechanic should cultivate the perception of beauty. What a charm and new value might the farmer add to his grounds and cottage were he a man of taste, end quote. I didn't say it. Channing was advocating for laborers freeing themselves from mindless servitude to the machines of the Industrial Revolution. And we ought to give him credit for the good that he was doing there. He wanted these folks to see themselves as fully worthy human beings, not just cogs in a money-making machine. Channing urged what he called an elevation of the working mind and spirit. Though labor was essential, so too was learning, he said. The two should be better balanced in the lives of the laboring classes. He wrote, I don't expect a series of improvements by which the working person is to be released from his daily work. Still more, I have no desire to dismiss him from his workshop and farm, to take the spade and axe from his hand, and to make his life a long holiday, end quote. Well, the conversation was tricky then, and it remains so today. In my own life, I've applied some of Channing's encouragements and rejected others. I discovered a love of reading and learning early on. I followed that love to become the first person in even my extended family to get a degree. A 4-year liberal arts degree in journalism changed everything for me. It made me a social class jumper, which I think more than anything means I'm never completely comfortable in any gathering of people. But I didn't learn in place as Channing prescribed. I became a white-collar worker. Or a clergy-collar worker, I don't know. Channing probably wouldn't have objected to my path, but his hope was to offer some dignity to lives spent in blue-collar occupations. And that is work we still have before us. The work has changed a lot since Channing delivered his lectures. It's changed a lot in the last 30 years. One report tells the story well. It's true that according to a 2014 study, blue-collar workers still comprise 61% of the American workforce. But, and this is a quote from the report, in recent decades, perhaps no segment of the job market in the United States has experienced more job loss than the manufacturing sector. Timothy Egan reports this mainstay source of blue-collar employment within the American economy has shed 6 million manufacturing jobs over the last 3 decades. New jobs, where created, don't match the quality of lost jobs. One recent report notes that employment losses from the 2008 recession were concentrated in mid-wage occupations with median hourly wages between about $14 an hour and about $21 an hour. Recovery growth, however, has been concentrated in lower wage occupations, jobs paying a median hourly income between about $8 an hour and about $14 an hour. These jobs accounted for only 21% of jobs lost, but now account for 58% of recovery growth. Keeping quality jobs remains as strong a concern as holding down an existing job. In this time of breathtaking change, people are being left behind. Blue-collar jobs are more scarce and in large part lower paid than they used to be. There's hope for folks who are now entering the job market. What some are calling middle-skill jobs are on the rise. These jobs usually require a 2-year degree or one kind or another of vocational training and have to do with things like supervising manufacturing processes or being dental hygienists or radiologists. These jobs have decent salaries, mostly about $70,000 a year or a little more, but they do require some upfront training. Our national hyper-capitalist system makes it tough for some folks to get access even to a 2-year degree, though. States like Tennessee have recognized that and have made 2-year colleges tuition-free. If we're serious about the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which is the first principle of Unitarian Universalism, here is a field ripe for work. I know we're headed in the opposite direction in Arizona right now, fighting even to get money into public K through 12 education, to fix our teacher shortage and fully fund our children's education. But what could be more Unitarian Universalist than working to make sure all our children have the chance at happy and successful lives, working in fields that don't require a 4-year degree and 5 or 6-digit debt to enter? What could possibly be more Unitarian Universalist than that? Instead of going in that direction, some people, and they come from the political right and they come from the political left, some people have married blue-collar work to ignorance. We Unitarian Universalists ought to know better than that. If we're serious about promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person, it's worth questioning our assumptions about blue-collar work and the people who do it. We need to nurture empathic imagination. No matter what social class we're in, if we can't imagine someone not wanting to be like us, someone not wanting to do the job we do, then we're not doing so well in the empathy department. There are many who wouldn't take an office job for any amount of love or money. And a lot of days I see the wisdom in that, especially in the fall and winter around here and during spring training. On the other hand, one of my seminary professors called the outdoors that annoying thing I have to walk through to get to the next building. And maybe you feel that way, I don't know. Diversity is present in all aspects of our lives, vocation included. Our lives are richer, our congregations are better, and the work is more full when we revel in that diversity. rather than trying to decide who is like us enough to spend our time with them. So it seems to me we need pathways out of blue-collar work for folks, and we need dignified pathways into blue-collar work for other people. As citizens, we need to carefully be tending both of those pathways and to hold our elected officials accountable when those pathways get blocked, to work with them, to clear them up. And they're often blocked now. And we need, as a society, to value blue-collar work enough to make sure folks doing these jobs are paid a decent, livable wage. All of this, writing letters, contacting our representatives, all of this is the work of demanding the inherent worth and dignity of every single person. It is hard work changing our system in these ways. And I've tried to change my language recently about social justice. I don't like to think of it anymore as taking the mountain and finally conquering racism or finally conquering classism, and that's the day that we believe will come in our lifetime. Instead, it seems to me we ought to think about faithfulness. Have I lived a life faithful to the principles I say I espouse? Have I stuck to the fight even when it was difficult? It'll take a long time. It's gritty work. And it is energizing and community building, and progress is possible. May we move onward together toward the true dignity of every person with intention. Amen.